Hey everyone, today I'm going to go over material that tracks with Mankow's Chapter 6 in his ninth edition of Principles of Economics. We'll talk more about supply and demand and the government role in the markets, which not everyone agrees on. In this course, I will keep on pointing out that I'm not trying to tell you what you should think, what you should believe, but I am trying to give you the tools to come up with well-founded thoughts yourself. I want you to have the tools to think through, hey, someone's recommending this. What are the pros and cons of that? Who are going to be the winners and the losers? And what are the direct and indirect effects of those policy decisions? I want you to understand how the economy works. In this section, we're going to talk about price ceilings and price floors. Price ceilings are where the government sets a maximum that can be charged for a good. You may hear that when talking about goods during a disaster, so that there's no price gouging for generators or bottles of water. Price floors you're more likely to hear discussed when people say that other countries are flooding a market with cheap goods, or a company is selling a good cheaply so they can capture market share and eventually raise the prices once they've driven other companies out of the market. So does a price ceiling always matter? Well, right here, if someone's equilibrium price and quantity is for an ice cream cone is $3 for 100 sold. If the price ceiling is set at 4, that is not impacting. It's not binding, is what we're going to say here, because we're being told, hey, you can't charge more than $4. Well, no one was, so that's not an issue. However, if the price ceiling is set at $2 for an ice cream cone, we see here that at $2, only 75 are supplied, but at $2, 125 would be demanded. There's a 50 quantity gap there, and that's a shortage. So who's happy? Well, the 75 people who got their ice cream cones cheaper than they would have previously gotten are happy, but the 50 who don't get the ice cream that they want are unhappy. And producers may be unhappy because they're selling at a lower price as well. So this creating a shortage has issues. So you may have housing shortages, which if you look up anything about this, you're going to see people talk about housing shortages and how do we correct those. But you're also going to hear people talk about being charged too much. Why this is an issue, and hopefully through this you'll better understand why it's not a slam dunk fix. In the 70s, you may have heard of a lot of issues that were going on, stagflation, but there was the oil crisis where there were supply side shortages we were facing, and the government tried to figure out how do we solve this, and they tried to limit people getting gasoline based on what day of the week, what license plate number you had, etc. Well, shortages were created. Also, there's back many decades ago, there was a set price you could charge for airlines. In that case, it was a price floor. All these have effects. So you can see here that what may not be a binding price immediately, when supply changes, could become a binding price later on. When price ceilings were lifted, the lines at the gas pumps disappeared, but the scarcity may have led to higher prices and people driving less. But driving less is lowering demand, and the market forces balancing out. Here it talks about rent control, like I mentioned. Economists are mostly against rent control because they want the market forces to balance out, but they would recommend other solutions, maybe changing zoning laws so that more is built, maybe fewer single family homes and more apartment complexes, condo units. Again, we talk about winners and losers. Consumers enjoy lower prices, but they don't like scarcity. Producers don't like facing more competition. Talked about price floors. So if you are a business owner and trying to break into a market, you may think I will charge less than what it cost me. People will buy from me, and this is unprofitable for the other companies too. So they leave the market. Now I'm the only supplier. I can raise my prices back up. That practice is frowned upon. Typically, governments like to step in and set a price floor, saying you can't do that. There are problems with that, including monitoring. Uh, Also, it's not always domestic companies doing that. You may hear China flooding markets with cheap steel or other goods, so it becomes a international issue. The minimum wage, that is a price floor for the minimum you can pay someone. However, the minimum wage effectively makes low value jobs illegal. An example I like to use is I used to frequent gaming shops, and I know that some people would be paid minimum wage to sort trading cards. And that job, you're sorting low value cards, so it's a low value job, not adding much value to the business. When the minimum wage gets increased, it will be beyond what that job's value is, so they'll get rid of the job, even if there are people willing to work a lower wage. So that's a disemployment effect, and is a con of the minimum wage. There are alternatives that are discussed, whether it's universal basic income or negative income tax or just no minimum wage. And people disagree. Those can be costly, etc. But they do let the markets uh, handle this. You'll also hear people talk about should jobs exist if they can't pay a livable wage. Well, in that example, maybe it's someone who likes to sort cards and or just has nothing else to do with their time. They like to be at the hobby shop, so they want to do that job. Do you think that job should be illegal? It's an interesting question. I'm not going to tell you what you should think, but I do want you to understand the pros and cons of it. You'll also hear people discuss what was the minimum wage intended for? Was it intended for a single person to be able to raise a family of 3 or 4 on a single wage, or was it intended just saying we shouldn't pay people less for their time than this amount? Should it be indexed for inflation, etc.? Different people are going to have different thoughts on that. You can hear Roosevelt and others talk about that. So I've got Teddy Roosevelt here and then Franklin Roosevelt here, but we can talk more about that. I was afraid I was wrong, so I just checked on it, but no, that's right. That's Teddy talking about it, and then that's a quote from actual Franklin Roosevelt. We've got presidents of the same name. You can worry you made a mistake. So we talked about the government setting price floors and price ceilings. What else can they do? Well, they can step in and supply good themselves. So FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, can bring in generators or bottled water so that people aren't having to rely on the market, which may quote unquote price gouge. Or they can change laws, like I said, to encourage more building. So let's go ahead and pause for a moment so that you can attempt the quick quiz and unpause, and I will talk through the answers. All right. Question number 1, when the government imposes a binding price floor, it'll cause a surplus because of this higher price, because it's binding. There will be more sellers trying to sell a good than buyers at that price. 2 is D. In a market with a binding price ceiling, increasing the ceiling price will decrease the shortage because the shortage was created when you introduce the binding price ceiling. Increasing that price will, of course, decrease that shortage that was created. Rent control causes larger shortages in the long run, because over this time horizon, supply and demand are more elastic. So in the long run, you can change things, therefore it's more elastic. So in the long run, it'll make them more elastic. That's A. Question number 4, an increase in the minimum wage reduces the total amount paid to the affected workers if the price elasticity of demand is greater than 1. So what we're looking for here is which is going to change proportionally more. So if demand changes more, then it's going to reduce the amount they are getting paid more than the change in wage. We can talk more about this later. Think through the slope, like we talked about with the elasticity, and which is going to change more, and you can think about what is going to be the total effect. And remember, when you're reading these questions, look for the word binding and see if it's there or not. That'll help make sure you pick the right choice. So taxes. How is the burden of a tax shared? Look at what happens when you introduce a tax to a good. So you can see here, basically supply and demand. When you introduce a tax, that increases the cost. So that shifts the supply curve left. Since an input cost is going up, that's not on here that they shift. And the new equilibrium will be a lower quantity here, 90 from 100, at a higher price, $3.30 instead of $3. But also note that the sellers are not receiving the $3 or the new amount. They're receiving the difference between what is charged and the tax at this new equilibrium. So it's 280. So buyers are both paying more and sellers are getting less at a lower quantity. I talked a little bit about the minimum wage and some options and the alternatives like negative income tax or universal basic income. You can do a long deep dive rabbit hole of reading on your own. I recommend it. I've written papers on this. Interesting topic, one that's going to continue playing out. Also remember that minimum wages can be set at the federal level or at the state level. Some states have a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage. You can look at how that impacts border cities where maybe you've got a state with a $7.50 minimum wage and an adjoining state at a $15 minimum wage. How does that change where people work and how easy it is to attract and retain workers? Talk about who feels the burden of a tax. That's going to depend on elasticity, to what degree. We'll talk more when we talk about tariffs. But basically, it's shared between the buyers and the sellers. And if it is a demand with less elastic demand, so maybe a necessity, then the buyers are going to bear more of that burden. And for more elastic goods, the sellers will. Here you go. Now, if you say it's a tax on sellers or a tax on buyers, that's just the logistics of who pays for it, where it's paid for, but it's still going to have the same effect on supply and demand and the new price that buyers pay and the amount that sellers pay. You can see that even though it was levied differently, it's levied on the buyers, it's a shift in demand to lower demand. You're still going from a quantity of 100 to 90, a price of $3.30, sellers still getting $2.80. You can see it doesn't matter who it's levied on. The aggregate response is the same, even if it's different because it's through shifting supplier demand. You're still going to be paying the 50-cent tax. You're going to get charged more. Seller's going to get less, and the quantity is different. And then we would talk about deadweight loss and where that's created. We'll talk more about that later, though. Again, this just talks about mandating who pays the tax, irrelevant. And this goes more into detail about the elasticity I mentioned and who the burden falls more upon. Recommend reading through all this. I won't duplicate what I've already said. So right here, when it gets into who pays the luxury tax, it's more than just the logistics of whether the tax is levied on the buyer or seller. It talks about the impact. So if you're trying to change behavior or if you're trying to raise revenue and the government says, hey, you know what, we're going to tax yachts. What effect is that going to have? Is that going to yield a windfall of tax revenue that we can spend to fund education or some other thing we need? Well, maybe not. If the elasticity of a luxury good like yachts is pretty high, and one might expect it to be, then the demand may shift to another good, a substitute. And then instead of generating revenue, there's not going to be any revenue, and the employees are going to be hurt. People who build the yachts, they're going to lose their jobs. That's a negative indirect effect of that policy. So that's something you have to think about if you're, hey, we're going to certainly generate this revenue. Well, you didn't generate any revenue and you hurt employees. So what's the solution? Well, that's something we have to figure out. So take a minute, pause it, and let's wrap up with this quick quiz, and then unpause once you've made an attempt. I highly recommend actually attempting the quick quizzes instead of just not pausing it and hearing what I say the answer is, because it forces you to think through this and try to figure out, okay, why did I get it wrong? And that's going to be your best avenue for learning. So question 5, a $1 per unit tax levied on consumers of a good is equivalent to A, a $1 per unit tax levied on producers of the good, because it's the same result here. 6, when a good is taxed, the burden of the tax falls mainly on consumers if D, supply is elastic and demand is inelastic. So I mentioned that necessities where demand is going to be more inelastic, the incidence is going to fall more on consumers, and suppliers can, if they can change how much they supply easily, then they're going to react and do so. So it's going to fall more on consumers. 7, which of the following increases quantity supplied, decreases quantity demanded, and increases the price that consumers pay? That's going to be C, the imposition of a binding price floor. So setting a minimum price that you can charge for something. Suppliers are going to want to supply more, but buyers are going to demand less, and so it's going to increase the price. That's going to be a surplus type situation. And then 8, which of the following increases quantity supplied, increases quantity demanded, and decreases the price that consumers pay? That's going to be B, the repeal of a tax on a good. Rare situation for things to move all in that direction. So what is the economy governed by? Talk about supply and demand, but also the government will interject itself in situations where it's seeking to solve some sort of problem. Again, make sure that, in addition to the key concepts there, you're paying attention to binding. If something is a binding constraint, so it actually has an impact on price and quantity. And that's it. So it's just reading through there and thinking through if you have any questions. And if you do, please let me know.